Welcome, I'm Curtis Haymore, the National Capital Area Skeptics, and today we're having a talk by John Cmar, Why You Should Be Skeptical on the Media's Medical Reporting. John has been long enthralled with horrible infections that could spell doom for mankind, as well as sanity and skepticism in the practice of medicine. He is currently an instructor of medicine at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine and the assistant director of infectious diseases at the Sinai Hospital of Baltimore. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Before I get started, questions. Is there anyone in the audience who will admit to considering themselves to being a member of the media, like a journalist or a reporter? I'm actually a little surprised. Or maybe you're out there or you're lying. Anyway, this is not intended to be a media bashing session as I'm about to go into, because that's actually not very skeptical. And even though I constantly say things like, you turn on the TV for anything, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, Shudder, and say the meeting is, all the reporting is horrible, that's not necessarily true. But there's enough of it that is, and there's a lot of complex issues that go into it that perpetuates this sort of thing. And it's very important to think about this topic a little bit for a number of reasons. My personal interest in this is that I apparently am the only doctor at my institution that gives me money, which is Sinai Hospital. All my teaching stuff's at Hopkins, but they don't pay me for it. Who, whenever a news story comes up, they sort of say, so who wants to talk to the media? And I'm the one who apparently looks up and everyone else in the room is pointing at me. So I've been on WJZ a bunch of times just being interviewed about things like in 2009, I felt like every week I was having an interview either on radio or on TV about the H1N1 issue, and anything like that crops up. Sometimes I'm tapped to do that. And so I've had a lot of interface with the media. I still do things I have some reporter contacts in Baltimore, and so I occasionally will have an article I'm interviewed for in the Baltimore Sun. It's very interesting to see the classic thing of, they interview you for a few minutes at a time, and then they're trying to get this perfect audio soundbite, and it's invariably the thing that I say wrong that they clip out and put into the story. And so that's both frustrating and a little bit amusing as well. So the title of this talk is Why You Should Be Skeptical of the Media's Medical Reporting. One of the other things that I'm involved with, and this will get mentioned momentarily, is for my hospital, I'm the head of the Continuing Medical Education Committee, so the group that approves all the activities for physicians to get credit for CME to continue to renew their medical licenses in the state of Maryland. And as a part of that, one of the things that we have to focus on is making sure that there aren't any conflicts of interest in terms of when people are giving presentations. And so I always want to make sure that I tell you what my own disclosures are. And I'm happy always to have a new audience, because then I have a pun that I can do, because when it comes to disclosures, I have none. Makes me happy. Sorry. And so the other disclaimer would be that everything I say is my opinion alone and does not in any way, shape, or form represent anyone at Johns Hopkins or at Sinai Hospital up in Baltimore. The further disclaimer is, again, as I mentioned before, not all of the media gets medical or science reporting wrong, but some certainly do. So the agenda of what I want to walk through over the next few minutes is I want to talk a little bit about the dynamics of public dissemination of medical knowledge, which is a fancy way of saying how we interact with the media, we being the lay public, and we also being scientists and applied scientists as physicians. I also want to, as part of this, the thing that we're talking about, what the media is reporting about, is the medical literature. And the medical literature is kind of a messy thing. And so I want to go into a few aspects of the medical literature so that we've covered those bases in terms of what some of the issues are and why it's not necessarily straightforward for news reporters, especially those who aren't necessarily trained in medicine, to be able to accurately report on those content. The next thing I want to do is go through some examples of reporting on a topic versus the reality of what the topic actually is. I have a few videos from YouTube that I'm going to use to have sort of a little bit of an interactive type of a thing, i.e. I'm going to play it and then I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think about what you just saw in terms of things, the way the report was constructed, tactics maybe that they were using to get their point across. So this is sort of the graph of what the stakeholders are when we're communicating about science. And in the center, of course, we have medical science, and I capitalize the word science because it's always important to say science as science because it's very exciting. The three groups that are closely tied in this are clearly, number one, the general public. And from a medical standpoint, you can define that also as patients. So it's key to point these three things out because it's not, if there is an issue with news reporting, it actually has to do with all three of these populations. You can't just isolate out the media as having an issue. And the reason I say that is because when you're looking at the lay public, you're looking at sort of a group of people who perhaps have certain barriers that need to be overcome. Certainly I'm not talking about specifically those of us who are in this room right now. But things like understanding of science, understanding of skepticism and critical thinking. The second group is, of course, scientists, people who do the research, and those of us who are sort of applied scientists who are actually doing it to people as physicians. And the third group is the news media, of course, in general, inclusive of reporters. So the barriers that go along with medical science are several. The first is that medicine is an analog thing. It has a continuum. It's not a digital thing. Much like anything else in life, there are very few yes or no answers in medicine. And especially with the way that news reporting is designed, it wants to be able to deliver black and white answers to people. It wants to be able to have brief sound bites that carry a lot of connotation. And a lot of times what we're doing in medicine, the research itself and the implications of it are very complex, and it actually takes a while to describe and needs to be thought about. And science, of course, is not a thing that's just a collection of facts, but it is a process. And so understanding where it is in that process is also important. And it's very hard, especially in any brief communication, be it written, be it video, be it audio, to get that across. Medical literature is rife with imperfections. There are plenty of examples of authors themselves having their own personal biases when they're publishing studies. And then, of course, the issue of a lot of trials, especially trials of medical devices or drugs being funded by drug companies. That doesn't invalidate the results of the studies, but it certainly does skew what gets published, because if a drug company does a trial on a new drug and it doesn't show that the drug works, and especially a lot of drug trials are done specifically to get approval from the FDA so that that drug can then be marketed to patients and then have physicians then give it to patients and make them money. If there's a negative trial, they may not publish it. And so there are certainly things like publication bias or ways that the studies themselves are written that may skew the results or may try to make a certain point that the data doesn't show. Certainly, statistics can be a vague thing, especially for those who have never taken statistics. And a lot of times people, when they're doing studies, will count on the vagary of statistics to try to either hide a point that they don't want to be seen or to make a point that may not necessarily be there. Also, this thing we do called evidence-based medicine, which I will talk about in a few minutes, can be a confusing thing for some people to understand. And it's not just the idea that we're not making things up. There's more to it than that. The last thing, and this is something that I've been far more interested over the last year, is that the way that journal articles are retracted if it's found that there was something that was wrong with them, or say the authors misrepresented something, is a very messy thing. People don't like talking about it, and oftentimes journals will not admit to the public the true reasons why an article was retracted. Most retraction notices are something like, this article has been retracted at the request of the author, and doesn't tell you why. And these are studies that may have been cited dozens, maybe hundreds of times subsequently by other papers, and that has sort of an important cascade effect on the medical literature and things that we understand, that for whatever reason, a lot of researchers don't like talking about their retractions because it somehow feels like it's an insult to their work, but really it's an important part of the scientific process. And like I said before, science itself is a process, not an end result collection of facts. In terms of the general public, there are several barriers that exist. The first is a lack of formal training in reading and understanding the medical literature. I am maybe a little bit of a strange bird in the sense that I propose that I think and we'll talk about this later, but I think there are some significant educational reforms that need to happen in this country. And it's not just the usual mantra of we need to be teaching people more science. It's we need to be teaching people the things that they need to succeed in life in 2011. And for me, that actually includes having a basic understanding of statistics. I think everybody should be taught statistics at some point at least into the high school level, because it matters for all the scientific stuff that we deal with, medicine or not, and it deals with how we interface with reporting, and I think that's critical. And the medical literature itself is not hard to understand. You need to have a basis of knowledge to do it, but if you actually get the journal article, these are easy to read, and these are things that I believe that anyone in the public should be able to not only have access to, but try to have access to and read. Number two, as I think anyone, especially anyone who's a member of the NCAS knows, prevalence of critical thinking skills. That's something that I think we need to find better ways to have taught to everyone at an early age, because it's that thought process that's critical with how we interface with the world. And of course, the other thing is that the general public, just in terms of generally, is not really doesn't recognize all the biases, all the cognitive biases that we have just as human beings, and oftentimes doesn't necessarily believe that. I use a couple of examples. I'm an infectious diseases doc. I see patients. So I often see consults for things that we hear about, anyone who follows, say, skeptical blogs or skeptical news, things like issues surrounding chronic fatigue syndrome, which is a real disorder, issues like chronic Lyme disease, which does not exist the way that some people would define it, or things like Morgellons syndrome, which also does not exist as a scientifically proven disorder. But these people are very passionate about what they believe, and they believe that they have that their symptoms, they mean something to them, and they will disregard the science because they truly believe that this thing exists, to the point where they lobby government to do things for them. They try to get money. They try to force doctors to do things in terms of lie to insurance companies to be able to pay their bills, and that's a whole separate discussion. But it has to do with the fact that if more people were sort of attuned to the fact that we have lots of cognitive biases, I think that would be a general way to improve things. One example, there are a couple examples that have cropped up over the last couple of years that help me make this point to patients outside of medicine, are things like some crappy surveys show that even now, still 10 to 20% of Americans believe that Barack Obama was not born in the United States. That's 10 to 20% of people, if you want to push that out. Or the whole mosque at ground zero thing, which was not a mosque and was not at ground zero. Yet there is still a chunk of people who believe passionately that that's what it is. And I use these non-medical examples to point out to people that, there's a chunk of people who believe things, and it's very possible to have mistaken beliefs about medicine, especially when you're looking at, even when you're in conflict with the evidence. One of the issues with regards to scientists is that we, especially practicing physicians, we lack time for outreach, especially when say I'm on productivity at the hospital, meaning I've got X number of patients that I need to see in order to keep my salary. These are very real pressures that physicians face. Certainly researchers are dealing with grant issues and productivity issues of their own. So in being able to interface with the general public and with the media is something that is impacted by this limit of time. A second thing is that even though doctors understand the medical literature, oftentimes we don't have enough time to be able to run through it and look at it and truly master it and know everything that comes out on a regular basis. The last thing that frustrates me is that a lot of my colleagues have a very, and I'm sure many of you have heard the term shruggy, attitude towards pseudoscience, meaning that they understand, for instance, that there's nothing to do with autism and childhood vaccinations, but when they're when they have an opportunity to speak out about it, they're like, people are going to believe what they're going to believe, and I've got to go see the next patient or do the next thing. The news media, of course, has some barriers as well. Oftentimes they are writing for a certain audience and education level. I didn't realize this until when I was I think it was in high school. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. We have two main newspapers, the Cincinnati Enquirer and the Cincinnati Post. And I always liked the Enquirer better, and I didn't understand why I liked the Enquirer better until I found out that the Cincinnati Post writes at a target audience of a 4th grade reading level, and the Cincinnati Enquirer writes at a 6th grade reading level. So the writing is a little bit more complex because that's what they decided to do. And so it's better written, it's more intelligently written, and so that's why it turns out I like that newspaper better. But there will be agendas from that standpoint. There's limited time or space to communicate a story, which, as how many of you, by show of hands, watch The Daily Show in here? Good. But it's one of the things that Jon Stewart is often critical of, is you have a 24-hour news network, and yet you have 5 minutes for a story that's important, and then you cut it off right when the debate is starting to get robust, or you're about to sort of go beyond what a regular news story is, and then you go into some fluffy crap that nobody cares about and that isn't relevant at all. And so sometimes these limitations are fictitious like that. Sometimes they're real. One of the things, especially now, is anyone who's on Twitter knows that there are some news services that broadcast to Twitter, and they've got 140 characters just like the rest of us to deliver a story. As a side note, I was also being a geek, I was at the World Science Fiction Convention doing some science panels a few weeks ago, and that's when the rebels finally broke into downtown in Libya, and there were all these tweets going on, and Cory Doctorow was up on the panel, and he's reading the tweets out, and then one tweet comes across that says, "Been confirmed that Saddam Hussein has been," I'm sorry, wow, that's mixing up two separate things. "It's been confirmed that Gaddafi has been killed." And then another tweet came in from another seemingly reputable source 5 minutes later. It says, no, he's been captured. And it turns out that neither of those things were the case. But limited space sometimes, and especially with trying to get things out swiftly, can lead to inaccuracies as well. Another important thing is to think about the mission of the media, which is important to explore a little bit. I have up here education versus reporting. There is a story that a physician colleague of mine once told me, who's at the NIH, oddly enough, just a few miles away. And he used to have a good friend of his who was a reporter. And the reporter, this was in the time when we were discovering lots of things about HIV infection. And at the time, the reporter was doing a news story and had interviewed him about sort of the epidemiology of how HIV is transmitted and things about the disease. He also went out and interviewed a bunch of other people about it too. At this time, one of the things we did know is that it's not easy to pass on HIV in the sense that it's not about sharing a utensil or sharing a toothbrush or drinking out of the same straw. But this reporter interviewed someone else who was convinced that you could pass HIV just by touching another person or by sharing a spoon. And so the reporter put this in the story. And the physician was furious at the reporter, and this ended up ending their friendship, which at this point had been going on for several decades. And he said, "Why did you put this in? You know, we've had this conversation. You know this is factually inaccurate." And he said, "Well, my goal is not to educate. That's your goal. My goal is to report. And I'm not going to marginalize what this other person said. I need to make sure that they get the chance to speak their piece, even though he knew that factually it was inaccurate." And so it's interesting putting this distinction between education versus reporting. Lest I talk about the media without giving references and being a little bit nuanced, there's a site called journalism.org, which is put on by the Pew Research Center's Project for Excellence in Journalism. They actually have, and the idea is that they want to make sure that journalists are held to a certain standard of what they do. And so this is sort of like the mission statement for journalism. So I'm going to read the statement of purpose, and then they have a 9 bullet pointed list that I'm going to go through very quickly because it makes a few interesting points. So they claim that the statement of purpose for being a journalist, what you're supposed to do, is after extended examination by journalists themselves of the character of journalism at the end of the 20th century, we offer this common understanding of what defines our work. The central purpose of journalism is to provide citizens with accurate and reliable information. They need to function in a free society. This encompasses myriad roles, helping to define community, creating common language and common knowledge, identifying a community's goals, heroes and villains. I thought that was kind of interesting. Pushing people beyond complacency. This purpose also involves other requirements, such as being entertaining, serving as watchdog, and offering voice to the voiceless. So they then codify sort of 9 basic principles that they see journalism as adhering to, and they define each of these, and I want to point out something from just a few of these. The first one is journalism's first obligation is to the truth. The piece that I thought was interesting from this journalistic truth is a process that begins with the professional discipline of assembling and verifying facts. Then journalists try to convey a fair and reliable account of their meaning, valid for now, subject to further investigation. Journalists should be as transparent as possible about sources and methods so audiences can make their own assessment of the information. So in this first principle, they're assuming that there is going to be a piece on the general public's part about synthesizing, understanding, and deciding about what's being reported, except I think we all know that that is very rarely how the general public interfaces with the media. Number 2 is its first loyalty is to the citizens of the country. Number 3 is its essence is a discipline of verification. Something I found interesting in here, it called rather for a consistent method of testing information, a transparent approach to evidence, precisely so that personal and cultural biases would not undermine the accuracy of their work. The method is objective, not the journalist. Seeking out multiple witnesses, disclosing as much as possible about sources, or asking various sides for comment, false balance, anyone, all signal such standards. The discipline of verification is what separates journalism from other modes of communication, such as propaganda, fiction, or entertainment, although certainly there are many aspects of journalism today that I think cross over into those. Number 4, its practitioners must maintain an independence from those they cover. It must serve as an independent monitor of power. It must provide a forum for public criticism and compromise. It must strive to make the significant interesting and relevant. And I think this is a critical piece that needs to happen for medical things, because honestly, when you're discussing some medical science, it's really boring to the lay public, especially with some of its implications. But there are things that we need to learn about and things that may need to be talked about, so you need to do it in an entertaining, interesting way without sensationalizing things. It must keep the news comprehensive and proportional. Journalism is a form of cartography. It creates a map for citizens to navigate society. Inflating events for sensation, neglecting others, stereotyping, or being disproportionately negative all make a less reliable map. And the last one is its practitioners must be allowed to exercise their personal conscience. And of course, the most important thing for me out of all of this is that the first statement, every journalist must have a personal sense of ethics and responsibility, a moral compass. So this is sort of like, to misappropriate a word, this is the journalist's Bible. This seems to be this group of independent researchers have come together with a coalition of journalists and said these things guide or should guide what we do when we're reporting on anything. Now, one of the things we as skeptics know is that this is something else important that I think everybody, separate from statistics, by the time of high school, everybody should go through debate class to learn logical fallacies, because I think this is really important too. And sadly, with all of those, journalists do often fall into certain logical fallacies when reporting stories. These include the use of emotionally loaded images, isolation of events from their historical context, limitation of debate to responsible options, which is kind of the opposite of false balance in a way, but it really depends on what story you're looking at. This I love, the framing of dissident viewpoints in ways that trivialize them, and oftentimes when you have, say, the side of science and the side of someone who's crazy, they'll go for the emotional context for the crazy person, which gets the audience on their side, and then have subtle language changes that dismiss the scientists as being soulless or uncaring or not really understanding what's really going on. Personification of complex realities. A good example of this would be Jenny McCarthy as the spokesperson for autism and vaccine, that false link. And then, of course, the objectification of persons and false balance also go into here. So what I want to do is just very quickly go through a little bit of my perspective on approaching the medical literature, or what I think the state of the medical literature is for people who aren't necessarily medically trained. Because like I said, I think everybody should be able to access the medical literature on some level. Why this is important is that medical studies are both easy and hard. They are easy to read. There is no beyond, say, the basic science that may be facts that people don't know. There's nothing in there that's preventing you from a language standpoint from you actually reading it. The problem, and this is even true for physicians, is sometimes it's hard to detect bias and overcome it in studies. The literature is massive in terms of the number of studies that are there. As I've mentioned, as a practitioner, there's decreased physician time as an issue, and dealing with superficial and sensational media coverage does not make this any easier. So one of the phrase you may have heard is some people describe the medical literature as trying to sip from a fire hydrant in terms of keep up with it. There's so much. This graph essentially at the bottom here is over a given period of time, let's say a publication month. This is the number of medical journals And on this side is the cumulative percent of relevant articles about a particular topic. So let's say infectious diseases this month of September. And this is pretty consistent, this has been studied multiple times, if I wanted to find all the articles that are really, really critically important for me to understand as a practicing clinician in infectious diseases in that month's time, if I read 5 journals, I would only be getting 50% of those articles. And so this is just sort of an illustration of, to truly keep up with the significant medical literature, you would have to be spending all your time reading medical journals, which practicing clinicians don't have that. Another problem that complicates dealing with media and science and the medical profession is the concept of science by press release, which I'm sure a lot of you have known. And this is not physician outreach into the media. This is when authors who have done a study, when the study's coming out, or maybe even a little bit before it, approach the media proactively and do a press release with the idea that usually this happens in 2 particular situations. One is that they're very passionate about something that they studied, and they can't draw very many strong conclusions in the study itself, but they have a different forum by coming out public and they say, this is what this study proves, I guarantee it, even though based on the study they did, when you actually read the paper, they can't say that, because they have to be conservative in their conclusions. The other thing is if they know there is an issue or a possible point of public contention or debate about what this study could mean. Often they will come out and have a press release accompanying the study to try to do damage control, sort of preventative damage control in a way. And sadly, what this also, in terms of the media, this can lead to biased coverage and incorrect conclusions that are drawn. 3 examples that I would imagine that all of you heard of. For instance, Andrew Wakefield's original article in The Lancet that has since been retracted, that is thought to be the start of the MMR autism debate. The day that it came out in The Lancet, if you read the article itself, ignoring the fact that the entire thing is fabricated, but if you ignore that fact and you read what was written in the article itself, it's actually pretty reasonable. Again, ignoring the fact he lied. The conclusions that he wrote are very, very conservative. He essentially said, based on this data, maybe there's something to the idea that the measles vaccine might have something to do with autism, and this needs further study. What he did in the press release is he said, I've definitively found the cause of autism. We need to stop using the MMR vaccine immediately. And of course, the other thing that came out since then was that he actually had money in a separate company that was going to make different versions of the MMR vaccine as split components. And so that was another reason that was probably motivating that. So that's an example of, he did a press release that was far and away from what he actually wrote in his journal article. Another big one that happened 2 years ago was the whole XMRV association with chronic fatigue syndrome. This was when there was a group of researchers who looked at this xenotropic murine leukemia virus-related virus. Good Lord, that's a mouthful. And they were looking to see if there was a connection between this and people who had chronic fatigue syndrome. They tested the blood of over 100 people who had CFS and found that 60-70% of those people were positive for this XMRV virus. And they tested a baseline representation of the general population who did not, and 3% were positive. So if you read the journal article, despite the fact that the actual text in there is a little biased in terms of they clearly were pro this concept, their conclusion was, this is significant based on what we did, and it should be explored further. And if you just read that article, I would completely agree with that. The same day it came out in Science, they had a press release that, again, the lead author on the paper came out and essentially said, we have found the cause of chronic fatigue syndrome, and made implications that we as practicing physicians should start thinking about giving chronic fatigue syndrome sufferers antiviral medications empirically to treat them, even though we didn't even know at that point what might work for this XMRV thing. Of course, the answer to how this has all played out over the last 2 years is that, for the most part, there have been a bunch of studies that have showed that very likely this was contamination both of the lab that the study was originally done in, and there were some procedural inaccuracies that were done. In fact, it turns out now that the XMRV virus, which no one had heard of before 2006, was probably created in 2006 in a lab as an accident by different viral mice exposures. There's no evidence that this virus existed before 2006, and so how was this causing chronic fatigue syndrome in people before 2006? And the last is the NASA story that you may remember from about a year ago, where they did some research on bacteria and said that they could utilize arsenic in their DNA. And the day that came out, they had a big press release that was very, very definitive in saying this is exciting. And I heard the press release and I was very excited. And then I read the paper and it was all very confusing. And it turns out that it's not that these bacteria naturally do this in nature. It's if you put them under duress and sort of force them to only use arsenic, they kind of do. And it's not nearly as exciting as what the press release sort of implied.
I would say they don't even kind of
get right.
The evidence that they even kind of do.
Right. So you would say don't.
Well, there's no evidence.
Right. Exactly. The things that they were interpreting as evidence, not necessarily true. So, as I said, evidence-based medicine is more than just the fact that we as doctors don't make things up. This term was only coined in 1991, and essentially it is a philosophy of how we approach the medical literature. It's saying that we need to use studies to guide what we do to people. There are some ways you can do a study that are better than others. And I'm very passionate about this because I actually teach evidence-based medicine to my residents, and then the interesting thing is that, then I teach them about the weaknesses of evidence-based medicine and science-based medicine. They get really confused because they've never heard of this before. But this is supposed to, as a process, speak to the core values of science. As you guys probably know, not all studies are viewed equally. The supposed golden god of evidence-based medicine is randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. Things like meta-analyses are supposedly good, but a little bit lower down on the list. And then you can have less rigorous trials, and then things like case reports and anecdotes. One of the other confusing things is that the different people who publish studies have different grading schemes, these very complex grading schemes with how they say what is a good study versus what is a bad study. And sometimes these disagree with each other, and it makes it harder for doctors, the media, anybody to figure out what exactly is going on. If I were to pick journals that I would say if you were interested in trying to read medical journals, there is a magical formula called the impact factor. And this is essentially calculated from the average number of citations that a journal if you average all the articles published, say, in the New England Journal of Medicine, the average number of citations by other journal articles after they've been published. So essentially it's a popularity contest. So if you are publishing articles and your articles keep being cited by a bunch of people, that must mean they're good. So if you rate the top 5 internal medicine journals on this impact factor, it's things you've heard of. The New England Journal of Medicine is number 1, Lancet is 2, JAMA is 3, Annals of Internal Medicine is 4, and BMJ is 5. What I think is really interesting is that PLOS won, the Public Library of Science won the Open Access Creative Commons free for everybody to read journal online, is actually hanging out about 6 or 7. So clearly there has been significant uptake of this as a peer-reviewed open access journal that anybody can always have access to. I'm going to skip through some of this for the sake of time to get to some fun things. So these are a few examples of medical reporting that I would like to go through that illustrate things about how things can go right and how things can go wrong. The first is, and again, this is referencing back to the Daily Show on Wednesday night. If you didn't see it, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, with whom I am more and more disappointed by the day, because essentially if you compare how he reports now versus how he reported 5 or 10 years ago for CNN, he has stopped being a doctor in his thought process and how he talks to people, and he's now a reporter. He does all this false balance stuff. He interviewed Andrew Wakefield a couple years ago, didn't ask any hardball questions. And there's ways that you can ask hardball questions of someone you disagree with while being nice and not being a jerk. And he totally dropped the ball on that. And his reporting to me is very, very frustrating. So he has a special report this week about that's looking at some of these medical issues stemming from exposures that the first responders to the World Trade Center had. There's a bunch of studies that have been in very prestigious journals in their particular specialty, like CHEST, which is the #1 pulmonary journal. The American Journal of Gastroenterology is the #1 GI journal. They've looked at lung disease and gastrointestinal symptoms in the first responders. This week, or last week, I should say, issue of The Lancet was entirely, which is interesting for being a British journal, entirely focused on 9/11. Every article in there, every primary study, every commentary was about looking back on 9/11 as the 10th anniversary. So the study that is in question from that journal issue of The Lancet is this one, which is the early assessment of cancer outcomes in New York City firefighters after the 9/11 attacks, an observational cohort study. And essentially they've been following, this group was already following a bunch of New York City firefighters before September 11th for a separate reason. Then September 11th happened, and a bunch of them were responded to ground zero. So they've been monitoring those people over the last 10 years with the idea of looking at what negative health effects from the exposure, from all the mess of nastiness they were exposed to could have done. What they found was essentially and the study is less detailed than I would like, but compared with the general population, World Trade Center first responders had a 19% increase in incidence of new cancers over the last 10 years of all types. This is not clustered to one specific type. And this is so I would say that's interesting, and we need to follow it a little bit more and a little bit sooner. Now, it's interesting, too, is that the cancer is not grouped by organ type or correlation. And oftentimes, even though we may not understand the dynamics of what goes into causing every single type of cancer, it's clear that certain exposures are associated with one kind of cancer or several types of cancer. So the fact that this was sort of looking at as being all over the board isn't specific enough to draw a lot of firm medical conclusions. The other thing is that certainly only 10 years out with something that could be a carcinogenic exposure is sort of too soon to be able to easily assess cancer risk. Then the interesting thing, and we'll see if this works, a couple videos. I'm going to show you this first video, which is very, very quick. This is a trailer. So Dr. Gupta has a special. I guess it was on Wednesday night. I think it's repeating today. It's not online, so I haven't seen it, because I'm lazy that way. I didn't program my TiVo to catch it. But this is a trailer for the special. So what do you guys think of that? And what I mean is I'm not talking about an opinion of one way or the other on the science, but just sort of the content. How is that trailer presented? Anyone? Yeah.
Well, it's very high on the emotion scale, and the sympathy scale. We all care about those first responders, so we're emotionally grabbed over it very fast. And they're saying one person's sympathetic feedback from doctors and nurses might constitute evidence.
Right, and then and separately, it's and to pull it out as a little bit more generally, it's the idea of this is a person who clearly believes that if the scientific evidence were to definitively say one thing, he would still believe a different way. And so what I think is interesting about that is that this is then a trailer to try to entice people to watch this special. And this is one of the things about reporting on issues like this that's very hard. I don't know that that was not necessarily a bad question for Dr. Gupta to have asked this man. But clearly putting this in this clip is trying to get you emotionally invested in this. One of the other challenging things with the science now, just to say it, I think that there is these exposures definitely, I think, have the potential to be carcinogenic. I think that they're definitely causing these medical problems. I think there's medically, this is very plausible as an exposure. But there are some people who disagree with it for whatever reasons, and especially in the US, especially now, there are definite patriotic overtones to the idea that would you not care about our World Trade Center first responders? Would you dare disagree with them that it really is something going on? And we'll talk about this momentarily, but this frustrates me about this because I don't even think that they need to put a statement or a question like that in the video because I think it's scientifically plausible, and I think this is a important thing to talk about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this segment from The Daily Show from Wednesday night. This is Jon Stewart interviewing Sanjay Gupta. What I want you to pay the most attention to is actually the first 30 seconds when they're showing clips from the actual special. So what do you guys think about the snippet that they showed?
Scary music.
Evil periodic table. Yeah, that's science. Science is bad. It comes from a black place, and there are elements and
Plastics and other parts of the periodic table.
Yes.
PL.
Right. So what I got from this is that again, and especially if you watch the rest of the interview, I understand the importance of this, and this is the thing that I'll jump to the frustration part because it frustrates me because usually I would expect Jon Stewart to skewer Sanjay about his reporting style, except that in this particular issue, this is a plausible the level of plausibility here is high. This is something that's very real. And so to see this type of emotionally charged imagery and things that are trying to evoke these very strong emotions is disappointing to me because it's like they're applying these tactics that sometimes we see when misapplied to journal articles or even to pseudoscience to something that's actually real. It's sort of like I can't watch the Olympics anymore because of the sappy personal stories and the emotion that they put in about this athlete had this horrible paper cut 5 years ago and then suddenly this music comes down. It's that type of thing. It's disappointing and it's not necessary. And in a way, it kind of turns me as a medical professional. I don't really want to watch this special, but it's very, very important. And so that's sort of my key in showing that.
There's a real trap there, too. You have these long latency cancers. So what you do is you do your meta-studies and you prove conclusively that there is no statistics now.
Right.
But then 5 or 10 years from now, there is. Now you're really in deep trouble because clearly you were lying before, et cetera.
Exactly, and that's and for those, and I don't know all the issues involved with this bill, but the whole reason he was on was because there is I'm sure I'm going to say this wrong, but there is a bill to go for financial compensation for the World Trade Center first responders that was essentially denied last year or earlier this year because there was no good scientific evidence at the time that there was any cancer as a result of it. And now there sort of is, and they're going to go back and look at it next year, and that's the main reason that Dr. Gupta is doing this. So again, it's for a good potential activist reason, and also we're around the time of the anniversary.
Well, this whole situation where the information now we have means that what we said before was wrong is painted out as being one of the problems with science, especially now I think back on the little preview you showed, because he says what if a paper said this thing that was completely contradictory to what the papers are actually saying? Meaning that papers will come out and say anything they want to say. There's no reliability there. That's the underlying message. There's no reliability to these published journals because they're just going to come out with a contradictory one next year.
Right. Exactly, and that's a separate thing. And again, going back to the biggest thing that groups like NCAS and what I try to do with my patients and my residents is try to explain, make sure people know what the scientific process is, and that's part of the process. You are going to have different people from different perspectives doing different studies that will disagree, but ultimately if you unify, the goal is that it's hopefully going to be unifying to what a consensus is about what's really going on.
It's really a disservice to the people who will have cancer in 10 years down the line. But I was wondering about Agent Orange. I mean, this had the same idea. It was very controversial. But did they actually, at the end of the day, really found? They had enough years now. Did they find definitive correlation? Yes. Thank you.
That's actually an interesting question because I don't know the answer for sure, and in a way, it doesn't matter. Because it gets into something else that's going on here, is that this isn't about doing science, this is about public policy, this is about getting these people money for their medical care, which is not necessarily the same thing as proving science. Why I say it doesn't matter with Agent Orange is if you go into the VA, this is true actually years ago, I've done a lot of work at the VA, and if you can tie, the whole point is once they had enough evidence to convince the government to say we can tie in these medical problems, if it was due to if you were in an area, you had an Agent Orange exposure, this suddenly becomes this service-connected benefit, and the government's going to pay for everything for the rest of your life, and you don't have to worry about it. So I don't know the answer. I've never looked it up because at the end of the day, the policy that people care about already happened, which is that enough people were convinced that Agent Orange was definitely causative such that veterans are now getting that compensated for.
But it's a precedent in some ways. So in that case, if it didn't work then, you might as well get the money now. I don't know. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
In a similar vein, the Gulf syndrome, Persian Gulf. Now that was interesting too because it was revisited, I presume. 1999 was the Persian Gulf War and the onset of these symptoms. And then a dozen years later, our troops are back in that same field of battle, and I'm curious to see, were some lessons learned, or was this the result of vaccinations against biological weapons or something?
That's an excellent question. I honestly don't know the answer, and fortunately, that is clearly, for better or worse, that's clearly not something that's been heavy in the popular media yet. Although who knows, that may crop up at some point.
That's interesting.
So the next thing I'm going to go through is this. This happened months ago, but I love this. This is absolutely fascinating, and it's more an example of reporting in the context of an issue and maybe making it more than the literature actually shows. So headlines to this topic are from the Washington Post. This is from a few months ago. Bedbugs may play a role in the spread of drug-resistant bacteria, MRSA study finds. The first line, anyone who has ever had a bedbug infestation knows full well what the nuisance the pest can be, yada, yada, yada. But a peer-reviewed study published online Wednesday in the Journal of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention suggests the pest could play a role in transmitting the disease. I like how they dropped in that it was actually a peer-reviewed study as a way to more further convince you of its import, and it's interesting when you actually look at the study. This is from what probably is clearly a very favorite blog from all of us who love science, the Huffington Post. Bedbugs with drug-resistant MRSA superbug germ found. And this was from Time. Thought bedbugs were bad? Try bedbugs with MRSA. So the background is that, of course, we live in a time when there is actually an epidemic of methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus bacteria that's causing skin infections in people, and more than that is causing very serious disease and is killing some people who otherwise are perfectly healthy. I personally have seen an 18-year-old girl who came in to the hospital with a pneumonia and she was dead within 2 days, and it was very likely just due to staph. We couldn't find anything else that was going on. A horrible, horrible, horrible disease. There also has been a resurgence of bedbug infestations in urban areas, as many of you may have heard in the news. since we're talking about the news. But interesting about bed bugs, even though they crawl out at night and they bite you and they suck your blood and fill themselves up with your blood and then leave, unlike things like mosquitoes and ticks, there is no known case in the medical literature, and people have studied this, of bed bugs transmitting an infection between humans or from themselves to humans. Why that may be is that it may be that something about viruses and bacteria cannot survive in the gut of the bug. Something about their saliva may kill it. And separately, in terms of something like staph, which lives on the surface of things, staph particularly has receptors that can bind to our skin cells. That's oversimplifying it, but that's the way it works. And they don't to the carapace of bed bugs. I'm going to skip the videos for the sake of time. So this study, so I thought this was fascinating. My wife actually called me on my way to work and she said, "Did you hear about this bedbug MRSA thing? I just saw it on Good Morning America." And then my response was, "Did they interview a doctor?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Was he a real doctor?" And she said, "Yes." So I went and I watched that video. So the study was technically peer reviewed because the Emerging Infectious Diseases is one of the top ID journals, not intelligent design, infectious diseases journals. But it was published as a letter to the editor. So this was actually a letter to the journal and was not a formal design. So it was a case report, if you want to put it in the scheme of evidence-based medicine. What they did is there were 3 hospitalized patients in Vancouver and found to be infested with bed bugs. And somebody got the idea of maybe we can look at the bugs and see if they're harboring any drug-resistant bacteria. So they, from these 3 people, they pulled off 5 bugs. They homogenized them. So they made a little bed bug milkshake. They smeared it out on an agar plate growth medium to try to grow bacteria. From 2 of the patients, each of which they got 1 bed bug, it grew a drug-resistant bacteria called VRE, or vancomycin-resistant enterococcus. And 1 patient, they got 3 bugs. I mean, if they're all infested, why did they only get 1? I don't know. But 3 bed bugs grew MRSA. The stated conclusion was bedbugs carrying MRSA and or VRE may have the potential to act as vectors for transmission. Further studies are needed to characterize the association between Staph aureus and bedbugs. Bedbug carriage of MRSA and the portal of entry provided through feeding suggests a plausible potential mechanism for passive transmission of bacteria during a blood meal. Because of the insect's ability to compromise the skin integrity of the host and the propensity for Staph aureus to invade damaged skin, bedbugs may serve to amplify MRSA infections in impoverished urban communities. So this, again, going back to my previous thing, talking about the plausibility of, we've never seen a report in the medical literature of a bedbug actually passing on a bacteria. It's kind of an interesting statement to make about maybe it actually happens when they bite and it passes in through the feeding. And if you actually read the paper or the letter, they do make a statement where they say Staph aureus, which is commonly found in the skin and can cause cellulitis, which is true, has been reported to colonize the salivary glands of bedbugs for as long as 15 days. Really? I didn't know that. So what does nobody else do? I looked at the reference. So this was a specific referred statement, and it referred to this journal article in the Journal of Public Health from 1963. Now, one reason why this is important is that MRSA itself is not a single thing. There are hundreds of strains that can affect humans. There are 2 very common ones that are the supposed community-acquired strains currently circulating in the US. There are 2 main ones that are the so-called hospital-acquired strains. Even more fun is there's now something called livestock-associated MRSA, which is a totally different strain that's cropping up in the Midwest. Don't know what the farmers are doing with their cows and pigs. But the interesting thing about this, though, is that these are dynamics that have changed over a few years. And it was rare to get any sort of MRSA type of a description back in 1963. So my questions are, why I want to look this reference up, is this even the same strain? What type? This is very interesting to me. This is very exciting. So I went and I pulled that journal article, and there was 1 sentence in that whole 1963 journal article that referred to this and said, bedbugs success, this is a quote, I did not leave words out. Bedbugs successful agents in transmission of hemolytic staphylococcus in rabbits, mice, and guinea pigs, only salivary glands of bugs infected up to 14 to 15 days, with a reference. Reference is from 1936 in a journal that was I don't even know what this journal is. Like, Google completely failed me. It doesn't exist. currently. And it probably hasn't existed for decades. So I can't find this, and it's interesting that they're basing sort of the meat of their argument of why it's important that why we found bacteria on bed bugs is based off of a statement that can't be verified. And I doubt has anything to do with what we're seeing right now. And so that's fascinating, but how many people actually look back to find it? That was my response. You'll see that picture a little bit later too. So if you put bed bugs on dirty people, they get dirty. That's essentially what this letter is proving to me. And it may be possible that, say, if two people were lying in bed, one of you had staph on you and the bug crawled in the staph, then jumped onto the other one, maybe it could transmit it. But again, it's kind of interesting, but it's not very exciting to me, and certainly not worthy of the news coverage that we've seen. So this I wanted to show another video for, even though I'm running a little bit long on time. So do you guys remember this? This is regionally important. Do you remember the case of Desiree Jennings, Redskins cheerleader ambassador, who in the height of the swine flu stuff in 2009 got a flu shot and then suddenly had massive neurological problems and carried a diagnosis of dystonia? Does that sound familiar to anyone? So essentially, this young lady received the flu vaccine in 2009. 10 days later, she had this gradual onset of a peculiar cluster of neurological symptoms. She had had the flu vaccine 2 previous times without any problems, and then madness ensues. So in the interest of getting to Q&A within the next couple of minutes, I'm going to skip over a couple of the other videos, which are all equally awesome, especially the last one where Inside Edition ambushes her months later outside of a grocery store, and she's perfectly fine, and then they go up to her and they start talking to her, and then she just starts speaking in an Australian accent. And this is the video where they actually interviewed, for those of you who read science-based medicine blog, Steve Novella, they actually interviewed him for that. And he's got the best quote of the entire thing is, "The flu shot does not give you the Australian accent." So a minute just to talk about this. So clearly there is a lot of problems with everything that we saw in terms of how the story was presented. The thing that frustrates me, though, one of the many things, is that they're framing it as it's either really due to the flu shot or she's faking it. And the truth is that it's neither. It's a psychogenic reaction, which is real. And in one of the stories, they pull out the phrase, "it's all in your head," which is one of the banes of my medical existence, because I hate when that comes up in the doctor-patient relationship, because oftentimes it ends up poisoning the patient to me trying to explain to them that I think that there might be a psychogenic component to what's going on, and then they immediately think I'm just saying they're crazy and that they're making it up and it's all in their head. And none of these news stories did a good job at all in sort of a nuanced reporting of what that means. So, really. So, I will take a minute to go through this. There was because it emphasizes a lot of what I was talking about. So someone tweeted to me a couple months ago a link to this story in the Telegraph in the UK. "A pint of beer a day keeps the doctor away. Could you look into this and tell us what it means?" I said, "Oh, sure, that sounds fun. I like beer." So what's really interesting is if you Google, I tried to find information. I found multiple articles, all of which sort of have this type of title. The background is that, of course, this is the classic thing where actually a lot of medical journalists get upset because they feel this is a segment of medical science where people do lots of frivolous studies. This is the whole thing where every time on the radio is like, coffee's good for you, coffee's bad for you, beer causes cancer, beer cures cancer, that type of thing that seems to be constantly coming out. People are constantly looking at associations between dietary practices and diseases. The best type of way to do this is a prospective sort of epidemiological study to tease out an association. The worst are non-clinical laboratory studies. This is the entire news article, and it essentially, from what I was linked to, and it essentially says that Beer has been found to strengthen everything from your mind to your bones, but we found that drinking a pint a day can reduce your risk for developing diabetes. Scientists found the vitamins, folic acid, iron, and protein deliver the same benefits as modern wine drinking. And this is a scientifically implausible statement because it's not this stuff in wine that is supposedly, it's the tannins and the phenols that are supposed to give you cardiac benefits, not vitamins and minerals. They studied 1,200 patients, and I was like, that's exciting. And then they even said, okay, so University of Barcelona, they gave some details. They gave me a website. Search the website, you can't find anything. And I was like, really? So I will not go over this quote, but essentially I then Googled, and I went through 10 different reports to try to find this study, and what I eventually found was that this was unpublished data that was presented at a conference. It actually was not published in the literature. You can't see it, so I don't know what they're talking about. The other thing, and the reason why I originally put this in is because they interviewed the author in a different story, and they said it was beer plus the Mediterranean diet. If you're not familiar with the Mediterranean diet it's fish, olive oil, wine, fruits, nuts. And it is very proven that this is an excellent diet for cardiac health. And if you look at the two articles, which I went on PubMed to see what else have they done, it turns out that they've done studies on the Mediterranean diet. So it's really hard to say what this, this is a journal article, this is a news thing that is citing something I can't even look up and may have more to do with the Mediterranean diet than beer actually, but then beer is what it's constantly sort of proposing as being the thing. So I'm going to end by talking about some goals. I talked about that there are these groups that have barriers in this. And so these are the goals. This is the thing that I would like to see happen. With regards to medical science, I think that we need to make sure as a community that the literature is made more available to the public, especially with open access, peer-reviewed journals. And I think that journals need to proactively develop alliances with the media to help report things, which is not something that actively happens right now. Retractions need to be far more transparent. The thing that I didn't talk about is that a lot of research when drugs are brought to market is the FDA will accept that if you're bringing a drug to market and there already is a drug that works, you can compare it not to prove that your new drug works better, but to prove that your new drug doesn't work worse. It's called a non-inferiority trial, and it's a standard for a type of a study you can do to bring a drug to market. And so, for instance, for treating MRSA, we have 8 antibiotics on the market, and if you ask me which one works the best, I don't know, because they were all brought to market on the basis of non-inferiority trials compared to the oldest antibiotic. Say what you will about the healthcare reform stuff, but there is funds for comparative effectiveness research, which is the idea that they're going to give money to people to study to actually prove what works better. So hopefully that will overcome that. From the general public standpoint, I think that we need to do some tweaks to our educational system, not just the science stuff like I talked about. I think everybody should be required to learn statistics. Everybody should go through a debate course to learn about logical fallacies, to think critically, clearly more science. And I think that what we all need to do is treat lay press medical stories skeptically. When I read the news or listen to the news, I treat it like Wikipedia. It's a good place to start, but I immediately pull up Google and I'm trying to find out how other people are reporting the same issue, because that way you can sort of eke out some of these strange things that we've seen. Good news outlets, typically New Scientist and Scientific American, have very good medical reporting. In fact, there's I won't go back to it, but the wine study, I went through 10 different news articles looking at this thing about wine and diabetes. It wasn't until I got to the New Scientist one where they just blatantly linked the original study. None of the other news articles from major news organizations even linked to the study or even tell you what journal it was in. So at least they're giving sources and they're giving a sober accounting of what's going on. I think scientists need to focus more on communication with the public. I actually think doctors should probably get a communications course in medical school and try to move beyond a shruggy attitude. And a hard thing is for us to figure out how to balance our educational mission, which is truly a mission of being a physician, with business, and recognize, as we went through all the principles of journalism, those aren't necessarily aligned with the scientific process. And if you know it, accept it, and understand it, that will help you overcome it. For the news media, I think news media sources need to form alliances with medical experts. And I've been fortunate to do that with a couple of reporters, like, for instance, at the Baltimore Sun or MD Magazine. And I think that's great. And I think that that's something that needs to happen more. They clearly need to raise the bar in terms of the quality of the story. And there are a lot of good things in those supposed journalistic principles, so keep to the principles. I'll leave this up as we do the Q&A. I think these are some key websites if you want to check something out. The newest one, which just celebrated its 1-year anniversary, is Retraction Watch, which is a blog that essentially screens for retractions throughout all of the scientific literature, medicine included, and actually tries to hunt down the people and will actually call physicians and say, why did you retract this article? And so far they do it from a good way, but they've managed to piss a few people off, and I actually think that's a good thing because they're stirring things up that needs to be stirred up. And they've actually uncovered a couple of people with a pattern of misconduct, and there are some people who have had something like 40 or 50 journal articles of theirs retracted as a result. Science-Based Medicine is a great website. Bad Science is from Ben Goldacre, a physician in the United Kingdom, and gives a decidedly UK bent on this. Center for Evidence-Based Medicine is another British website run by an old retired family practice physician who has a very dry and pun-rich sense of humor, and he does a weekly overview of all the major journal articles from the highest impact journals, and it's very fun to read. And the Cochrane collaboration is sort of like the evidence-based medicine gurus. And I will pause there for moving on to if anyone has any questions.
I find in my area, and I'm in a completely different area of profession, but reading the journals, I've read a number of criticisms that if you're to write a paper that reviews a previous study or tries to go into a little more depth, you're much less likely to get published than if you have some new, exciting, novel thing. And the writer of this article is actually saying that's one of the challenges is people are just encouraged to come up with something more exciting if they want to get published. Right,
that's definitely a challenge. And it's sort of linked into the fact that, especially in medicine, there's a move now that I'll say the residency gods, the ACGME, the people who sort of look over and administer residency programs, they want residents and fellows to be more academic. And this is a little bit of a separate issue from just a pure science thing. But so they're encouraging physicians to do more studies. And I think what's happening is that the end result of trying to encourage everyone to do more studies and be more scholarly, and also to encourage finding all these new things, is that you're getting a lot of crap. And it's not necessarily the best stuff that's coming out of it as a result. And so I would in a way agree with what that person had said. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So one question I thought of, that Dr. Buttar, whatever his name was, that had allegedly started that cheerleader.
Yeah.
What was his background? There was some association. He was this.
So he's a DO, and that is a very interesting long discussion that perhaps we can have later. Essentially, it's the whole, that's another type of doctor separate from an MD. I don't know how many of you are in the room are familiar with what DOs are. So the idea is, it's the whole, I can't remember his name, but the person who made up homeopathy talked about homeopathic and then allopathic and used that as a derogatory term to refer to what traditional medicine is. Well, a DO is an osteopathic doctor, and for the most part there are separate DO medical schools. You can go to these. For the most part you get the same training as an MD, but the foundations of the DO movement are based in magic. They're based in the idea that doing skeletal manipulation can pretty much cure anything. And in fact, I once went and presented infectious diseases stuff at a DO conference. I have a bunch of friends who are DOs, and I know I work with a lot of them that are very good. But it's because more of the modern ones recognize sort of the quack aspects of it and don't pay attention to it, and they do the good doctor stuff. But they needed me to come to this conference because for them to be able to get credit, they needed an actual MD to give 50% of the lectures. So they had 4 lectures, and I gave 2 of them. And I was absolutely shocked because, like, all my friends who are DOs are very reasonable, evidence-based, science-based people. And this old crusty guy came up, and from the beginning, I use that to talk about because there are old crusty people in the audience, and I'm getting there myself. From the beginning of that movement, essentially was talking about the evidence that he believes that you can cure influenza with spinal manipulation. And this was a serious talk. And I'm sitting here like, I can't believe, and I'm looking at my friends, and they're just like, I'm sorry, we have crazy people. And then they started talking about influenza, and they started sharing their immune boosting recipes, and they're all writing down like, oh, so you give 5 grams of cinnamon. And so I was in absolute horror. So that's sort of what, so it's a separate school of how you get to be a doctor. It's based in crazy. Most DOs, though, don't practice like that. They get the same medical training I would trust. Like one of my old primary care doctors was a DO, and I think that's perfectly fine. And the end result is that for some musculoskeletal type of complaints, they actually do a better job because they're better trained with doing joint exams and muscular exams and things like that.
Yeah. How common is it for doctors? I put those scare quotes there because. I'm thinking of someone I was just reading about who had some degree from a European university and is passing himself as an MD, but there's no evidence that he actually ever got one. He took a test to be licensed to practice in the United States, but he doesn't actually have a degree that would qualify as an MD. Yet he's doctor or somebody. I mean, how common is that?
It's very interesting. You're actually getting to the other one of my wheelhouses, which is in residency training, because we have a lot of international medical graduates. And essentially, there are criteria for medical schools to be able to issue an MD. However, most of the medical schools in the rest of the world don't give MDs, especially in India. Most of them give MBBSs, which are it's essentially and when you go and you get an MBBS, you essentially take college and medical school at the same time in the same institution, and you go straight through. And I can't remember what it stands for. There's actually an MBCHB in some of the schools in the United Kingdom, and there's a couple of other even wackier ones. But essentially, to be able to practice in the United States, even if someone who's from India gets this degree and has been practicing in their country for 10 years, maybe they went to fellowship and then have been a practicing physician for a while, we, from the U.S. standpoint, view that as a valid medical degree because there are standards that they have to adhere to. We get, like, if we're looking at them from a standpoint of residency, we get their transcripts, so we see what scores they got and what curriculum they went through. But they actually have to go through a U.S. residency training. And a lot of international medical graduates, even those who have been out as practicing physicians in their home country, maybe 5 or 10 years, often when they come to the U.S., they will go ahead and go through residency again in the United States so that they can actually practice here and get board certified and licensed here. Yeah.
I had 2 questions. One is, how would the psychogenic reaction have been properly treated? And then secondly, you haven't touched on complementary and alternative medicine is covered by the media. And of course, that's probably a whole other topic, but maybe just touching on that.
Yeah, so treating psychogenic reactions is really, really hard because it is often so you pick whatever word you want to use, subconscious, neurochemical thing, reflex. And I would approach, like if she showed up on my doorstep, I would approach it by first getting a neurologist involved, certainly, because clearly there are something neurologic is going on. And I, as a physician, don't want to miss a true thing, even though clearly this doesn't match up with any physiological correlate of a real disease. And then engaging mental health. I'm not even talking about meds. I would go a psychotherapeutic route. Like the first thing is you need to see someone from a mental health professional to talk with you, tease out what's going on, and for them to decide, is there something that could benefit from getting like a SSRI or other medication to treat. So that's how I would sort of start with that. With regards to complementary and alternative medicine, yes, that's a complete and total mess, and I could probably talk for hours about that. The problem is that I'll use one example, is it's about, more so than even with this, news reports tend to be far more credulous towards complementary and alternative medicine modalities. Some of you may have seen there was a study in the New England Journal of Medicine a few weeks ago that was a spectacular study and an awful study at the same time, and it's immediately going into my teaching file. And there were 8 authors on the study. Only 2 of them were actual doctors. One of them went to China for 5 years and somehow came out with a piece of paper that says he is a doctor of Oriental medicine. And he is the head of Harvard's Center for Placebo Studies. I didn't even know they had this. I'm now ashamed of them. But what the study was, essentially, it took people who had mild to moderate asthma. They stopped their medications, and they divided them into, okay, we're going to treat your asthma with an actual albuterol inhaler that we know works. We're going to treat it with a fake placebo inhaler that contains nothing but inert gas. We're going to treat you with sham acupuncture, not even real acupuncture, but sham acupuncture, so even the acupuncturists don't believe it works. Or we're going to give you nothing. The results were they did a subjective thing, survey, how are you feeling? They did an objective thing, we're going to use a device to measure your lung capacity. The people on the objective thing, only the albuterol fixed them, obviously. The other three things, including not getting anything, did nothing for their lung capacity. And that should be obvious. Subjectively, everyone who got something felt better to the same degree. So the people who got sham acupuncture felt just as better on a survey as the people who got the real albuterol inhaler. I love this because it's sort of tackling the complex issue of what goes into what people call the placebo effect in action. I think it's a great example of that. If you read the paper, though, they essentially say what this means is all these other things made people feel better. That's number one. Number two, as doctors, our mission is to make people feel better. Number three, we should be paying more, in people with asthma, we should be paying more attention to subjective measures of how people are feeling than how their lungs are actually doing. They essentially wrote that in the journal article, and this got published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which frustrated me as well. I think there was another question over here.
Did you ever hear of anyone becoming really ill because they had watched the stories of this a cheerleader and were afraid to get a flu shot and ended up with a serious flu?
Oh yeah, this is a huge thing. I mean, I have patients who would come in and they would reference Desiree Jennings by name as one of the reasons why they wouldn't get a flu shot. Yeah. It's sad. All right, any other questions? Are we done? Okay.
I think it's a good time to stop here and we can continue the conversation afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.